Hello, and welcome to Your Multi-Cloud Strategy, the 2017 virtual event. My name is Rhonda Lay with Argyle Executive Forum, and it's great to have everyone joining us today. I have a few administrative details to share with you, and I will turn things over to our esteemed speakers. First, we would like to thank Nutanix for their partnership with today's event. They've been a wonderful thought leadership partner to Argyle and are committed to providing you with valuable content and great overall experience. So thank you again to Nutanix. We appreciate you joining us today. We welcome you to stay connected during today's event. For those of you who are active tweeters, please use the hashtag CIO webinar. You can also follow us on Twitter at Argyle Exec Forum, and be sure to join our LinkedIn group, CIO-CISO Forum. I also wanted to take a brief moment to touch on our content neutrality policy, which we've curated based on the feedback we've received over the years from our members. Argyle is very proud and protective of this policy as it reflects our commitment to ensure the neutrality and overall value of the content presented at our events. We've worked closely with our speaking faculty to ensure that you receive a set of balanced and neutral viewpoints during the session today, and we appreciate our members' support of this policy. We'll also be sending a brief feedback survey to you following the event, and we'd greatly appreciate your feedback as it helps us to make sure we are always improving your experience. If you have any immediate feedback, please don't hesitate to reach us at feedback@argyleforum.com. We also have a sampling of upcoming Chief Information Officer leadership forums that may be of interest to you. Chicago, September 12th. New York, September 27th, Toronto, September 27th, San Francisco, October 26th, Boston, December 7th, and Atlanta, December 12th. Finally, and most importantly, please submit any and all questions that come up during today's event into the Q&A section of the interface. Following the panel discussion, we have set aside time for our speakers to weigh in on these questions. Without further ado, I would like to introduce Wendy Pfeiffer, Chief Information Officer at Nutanix. We're pleased to have Wendy with us to deliver opening remarks. Welcome, Wendy. Over to you.
Great. Hi. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us today, and I'm really pleased to be here and have a chance to share with our wonderful panelists and with all of you. So our topic is multi-cloud strategy. And I thought maybe I could start by just sharing some of my thoughts and the things that I've experienced in my multi-cloud strategy. Right now, I'm the CIO of Nutanix. Previous to Nutanix, I was the CIO at GoPro, and before that had similar leadership roles at Robert Half and at Yahoo, and even way back in history at Cisco Systems. So I've had experience in lots of clouds and have really enjoyed this journey that we've been on with cloud. You know, way back when, a decade ago, most of us really only had to deal with a single cloud, or we'd make a choice about the cloud, whether it was public or private that we were in, and then after that would drive all of our decisions. So, you know, that was then. So now, though, especially as IT leaders, we are really having to master this notion of multi-cloud. And so I just wanted to talk a little bit about, from my perspective, what's been driving that trend. You know, there are some good reasons and some bad reasons for having a multi-cloud strategy or needing to have a multi-cloud strategy. The good reasons, they're sort of mom and apple pie for IT generally, right? It's obviously minimizing the risk of data loss, minimizing the risk of downtime, you know, just having your eggs in more than one basket. Of course, there are folks who need different clouds to improve performance, perhaps page load times, or dealing with local or regional access challenges that having clouds in different geographic positions can address. Or improving search engine performance, having lots of pathways in to your content sometimes can help to improve just people's ability to find your content. The one that matters a lot to me is avoiding vendor dependency and ultimately improving my ability to negotiate by essentially being able to say, well, hey, I'm not dependent on you. I can always go to another vendor, or I'm already operating with another vendor. And also, we need to use appropriate clouds for appropriate tasks. So, many of us, we use public cloud for internet or consumer-facing transactions, private cloud for data-intensive or secure transactions, hybrid cloud for mixed use, or just looking for the cheapest solutions for different workloads. On the other hand, there are also some bad reasons that we have to manage multi-clouds or even to build a strategy. A lot of times a non-IT department maybe adopted something in a different cloud, and now I need to manage it or secure it or operate it. Or sometimes when I first started out, it seemed cheaper and faster to build or consume services in whichever cloud was most appropriate. Recently, Snap went public, and we got to take a look at their financials along with the public offerings. And what I was able to see is they're spending about $450 million a year on public cloud, about $400 million on AWS, and $50 million on Google Cloud. And you think about when they started out, I don't think they expected to be making that much, to be spending that much on public cloud. But at least in 2016, the year they went public, they were spending more on public cloud than their annual revenues. And so sometimes we start out in a new and shiny place, and then realize, well, we have some decisions to make, whether those are around cost or code base or whatever that might be. So acknowledged we've got that cloud, and I sort of talked through some of those good and bad reasons. Ultimately, infrastructure as a service, it offers some unique benefits, but also some unique challenges. So if we look at traditional IT, there's some history there, right? Initially, public offerings from AWS and Google, I think you all kind of remember they had that consumer tech feel. So management features, security features seemed kind of like an afterthought compared to on-premise technologies. And I remember my teams saying, well, yeah, we've got a couple things running up in public cloud. At the time we were in AWS, but we can't do archiving the way that we need to. There aren't the journaling isn't available. We're struggling with some of the ability to monitor, et cetera. That was so 5 years ago, because really all of the offerings have matured, and IBM and Microsoft and Oracle's entrance into the market really have pushed this enterprise feature parity in public infrastructure as a service to be closer to private cloud. But there are still some IT people who come from a more traditional background who have these long memories, and they'll add to the conversation, well, there have been some very notable public cloud outages. And so, there's still sort of that old school group of us who are saying, well, public cloud, it's not as reliable, it's not as secure, et cetera. In fact, that's really not the case anymore. There are some amazing features, around security management, monitoring, et cetera, in public cloud. And in fact, I might add, I think even the pace of innovation in public cloud is driving those advances, perhaps even more dramatically than the work that's happening in private cloud. Another challenge, though, for companies is, I guess we'll call it DevOps teams. And so, composing code to run on public cloud for many companies is still a different process than composing our code to run on premise. So, there's some common threads. Public cloud requires inclusion of infrastructure layers in the application build code. And so, I often hear companies saying, well, my infrastructure teams, they can't script, they can't code. They're not developers, and I often hear, software developers saying like, well, we don't want to be worried about the infrastructure. And so this sort of DevOps notion has come that says, we've got, we can compose infrastructure as code. However, if you have composed infrastructure as code, the way that many companies that started in public cloud have, then it's actually hard to go the other direction. It's hard to go more in that hybrid direction with that same set of code. Another challenge is that cost-effective public cloud requires the ability for application processes and the infrastructure under layers underneath to be essentially torn down when they're not in use and to be recomposed quickly when they're needed. And so that's sort of a different notion, for people who write code and also people who create infrastructure. But essentially, if you have very flexible instances that can be decomposed and composed relatively quickly, you have access to cheap public cloud. But if you need reserved instances, if you need instances to remain up, to remain running, well, that's a more expensive model, and in many cases the cost is very comparable to something that might run in a hosted or on-premise data center. The last bit is, and this is something that I recall learning a few times before I really got it in my career, is that public cloud resiliency is achieved not through system perfection like we do in our private data centers and in our private clouds, but it's through hypersensitive failover and unlimited compute resource. And so people who have only written code for cloud, they're not building fault checking and fault tolerance into the code itself. Instead what they're doing is we're monitoring to see if there are challenges that the code is putting on resources. And for example, if there's a memory leak that begins to consume more than its fair share of resources, well, instead of going back and spending the 3 weeks or 4 weeks of coding to find and address that memory leak, we may just, in public cloud, create some monitors that say, hey, when a certain percentage of system resources being consumed, we'll just wipe out that instance and recompose a fresh one, and the code will continue to run. And so that's a very different model and a very different philosophy, and it just sort of leads to some of the challenges with portability. It's also the case that there are really, really different architectures, across clouds. So not just at that code layer, but also at the how we compose the infrastructure layer and the components that are in those layers as well. And so, for example, I may be heavily using my Cisco engineers in my private cloud or across a hybrid or distributed cloud, but may not even need those skill sets when it comes to public cloud. And so there's sort of that just a different mindset and a different way that we're composing and calling all of the layers. So that kind of brings us to the last component that drives us to a need for strategy, and that's just our multi-cloud integration challenges generally. So I think first of all, cloud vendors are sadly continuing the tradition of on-premise vendors by building and supporting proprietary, or at least different, technologies. So for example, I mean, hopefully these are things, that you're all familiar with. I'm stating the obvious, but, AWS, it has a distinctly Linux bias. It's Linux at the core. On the other hand, if you're running in Azure, obviously, sometimes a little painfully, it's Microsoft Windows based. Software portability or between or among multi-clouds, it's virtually unavailable at the code level, with some notable exceptions, but certainly, we do have some challenges with code that we've created to run, particularly in one cloud, or to call functions in a particular cloud. Now, in IT, we are approached by many SaaS vendors who seek to obviate this challenge by attempting to offer these all-in-one, all necessary services with one platform. But in my opinion, ultimately these monolithic platforms, at a minimum, they're expensive, and they're expensive to continue to contain, to continue to build. They're complex, but ultimately as well, there are multiple less than ideal components that sort of make their way into the code base and our usage. The last thing is also a challenge, and throughout my career, it's it's not the most complex challenge, but in many ways it's the most time-consuming and the most resource-consuming, and that is that IT professionals, and I guess just human beings generally, we tend to be technology-centric. Multi-cloud skills are really, really scarce, and we just continue to struggle with that, especially when you get someone who is truly capable. I'll find that person is, gets some joy out of getting, all the VMware certifications, or that Cisco CCIE, or the AWS certs, or whatever it might be. And so there's that, that sense of ownership and pride in the really good technology professionals, and there's still a challenge there. So I just want to share my multi-cloud strategy, having lived through all of these challenges for a number of years. Here's what my multi-cloud strategy contains, given all of those inputs. First of all, it's important to maintain an inventory of workloads, of all the workloads that I am running or that I expect to run, with their characteristics. Is this Linux-based? Is this proprietary, commercially written software, et cetera? And also the planned characteristics over time. Where is this workload moving over time? Is there a roadmap? For example, ERP applications tend to just run. There isn't really a need to update or replace core ERP technology every year, and it's a beast to do that. On the other hand, when we're looking at some of the innovations in collaboration applications, it might make sense every 6 months or so to understand what's current and what's out there. Secondly, just an inventory of available clouds aligned to complete with a rating on how they handle the characteristics of each of my workloads. So perhaps I'm already consuming Azure because I have O365, I may be consuming AWS, I've got my own on-prem, maybe I've got some SaaS applications, and just understanding on my thoughts and my team's thoughts on how they're handling the characteristics of each workload, and really pricing models as well. And then this is really important. These next two things, we need a plan, a tool set, and a person for tracking and managing costs across all of these mediums. And then a plan, a tool set, and a person for managing and securing the data. Data continues to be a challenge for us because we're still in the mode of setting one policy and then figuring out how to apply that policy across the multiple different clouds where we're dealing with data. And in fact, clouds, deal with data differently, access differently, et cetera. And then ultimately, we need an active mechanism for dynamically applying clouds to workloads as the workload characteristics dictate. So this implies purpose-built apps and code sets that run anywhere. And so, if you have the luxury of writing your apps and your code from scratch, you would do well in a multi-cloud world to ensure that the code that you're writing runs anywhere. Or alternatively, a core cloud operating system that can run anywhere and serve all the workloads and all the apps, even those that were not purpose-built for multi-cloud. Or finally, if you don't have the luxury of either one of those things, then a large and skilled team who perform these tasks as dictated by your constantly monitored conditions. You can see in all three of these cases, there's some investment, there's some money, but you need one of those three or some combination really to enact this strategy. And so ultimately, when they go high, we've got to go low as CIOs. Basically, details count, folks. As an owner of a multi-cloud environment, I have got to understand at a detail level what's happening and leverage the detail and the data to enact my strategy. So I need these three essentials. I need monitoring and management tools, whether homegrown or commercial, and they need to span on-premise and public clouds. And if I'm doing anything less than that, then it's expensive and I'm missing things. Secondly, data movement among clouds needs to be supported dynamically with code and tools and common data structures, but the key there is that it needs to be supported dynamically. And a lot of times we struggle with that, whether because of our security constraints or other items. And then, team members need to be able to compose infrastructure as code, and cloud infrastructure must be composed like on-prem infrastructure if I want to swing workloads dynamically. So a common OS is extremely helpful for that. Though, without those three basics, multi-cloud is kind of an expensive and complicated trap. It sounds good at a high level, but it's impossible to support on the ground if you're not cognizant of all of these areas and constantly watching them. So, that's sort of the intro, at least just sharing my perspective on multi-cloud, and appreciate everyone listening. And now I thought what I would do is move to engaging our panel participants. And so to start, I just wanted each of us to introduce ourselves, so those of you who are listening in the audience have an opportunity to know the esteemed members of our panel. So Robert, why don't you kick off the introductions, please?
Sure, thanks, Wendy. My name is Robert Doty. I'm the Vice President of Infrastructure here at Servicemaster. The reason that this was an extremely appealing event for me, number one, is because a lot of what Wendy just presented, and Wendy did a fantastic job of doing that. A lot of this that you just presented is something that we are either going through or have gone through. So I appreciate the time in the next hour or so for us to collaborate and share some of our challenges and successes.
Great. John?
Hi, this is John Koester. I'm the CISO at HD Supply. We too are challenged with some of these obstacles and migrations that Wendy talked about. And from the security side of things, our goal is to be an enabler, not a disabler. So how we approach the multi-cloud strategy is extremely important to manage risk versus cost versus efficiency.
Thank you, John. Dalia?
This is Dalia Powers. I'm the divisional CIO and CTO for consumer auto finance with Capital One. We've gone full-fledged with a cloud strategy and public cloud, actually. So it's really going to be a very important discussion for us as we push and pull on some of the pros and cons of the multi-cloud strategy approach.
Great. Thank you, Dalia. Duke?
Hi there. My name is Duke Trinh. I'm the Vice President for Innovation and Emerging Technologies at Wells Fargo. What this really means is we simply get to play with new toys, break a lot of things, and have a get-out-of-jail card, so to speak, to still get away with stuff. But we are, like many of my fellow panelists, we are going through a cloud transformation exercise as well. And especially in my area, the agility and the ability to be nimble to get things done is of utmost importance. So, but that needs to be balanced against the risk that the company is willing to take on. So we are very much knee deep in this journey.
Great. Well, thank you, Duke. I think Duke has the coolest job. He got to use the word play. I'm jealous. So let me kick things off and just kind of set the stage for the rest of our discussion. Panelists, I'd love maybe just to go through one by one, and just if you can briefly tell us how are you or your organization, how is your organization building and implementing a successful cloud strategy? So maybe just tell us where you are in terms of your usage of multi-cloud and where you see that going. And Robert, maybe we can start with you.
Sure, yeah. So here at Servicemaster, we are using two what I consider on-prem data centers, and we have cloud partnerships with two of the major cloud players. What drove us to that particular setup, we did a lot of things wrong initially, and we realized that, and so we kind of hit the reset button and moved to similar. I think what you were describing was we built a coalition, and we realized this isn't an infrastructure play. It's not just an applications play. It's an infrastructure, applications, finance, business units. It really is. It's not a single player in that team. It's a coalition of those folks. So we grabbed some of the forward-thinking individuals from each one of those teams and created the Cloud Coalition. That team put together the strategy that Servicemaster is in the process of implementing. That strategy is built very much so on a framework of questions that help lead our engineers, architects, administrators into when is the appropriate time to use the cloud? When do we use each one of our clouds? Do we use, we use AWS? Do we use Google? Do we use Microsoft? Or do we leave it on one of our on-prem data centers? And so that framework is literally a series of questions that the engineers and architects go through, and at the end of that series of questions, it lands them into the thought pattern of this is where you reside. And that's driven based off of the user experience, who's going to be using this application or tool set, where those users reside, what other applications does it integrate with. And so it's a relative comprehensive set of questions that get us down to that answer. Doesn't mean that it answers every single question and it's always perfect right out of the gate, but that's where that team constantly is reviewing where we're at with our strategy, what are the challenges or pitfalls we found, and moving towards there. I like your other important piece with kind of the multi-cloud strategy of common operating environments. Standardization was a huge thing for us. We literally built Snowflake servers and Snowflake applications up to the point where we really got serious about a cloud strategy, and that forced a lot of standardization across our enterprise. So that has helped us move much faster and being able to adopt an overall cloud practice.
Got it. So coalition and learning. John, what about you? How are you and your team building and implementing a successful cloud strategy? And I realize you've got the CISO role, so if you want to focus on cybersecurity as an important element, we'd love to hear about that.
Yeah, sure. You mentioned shiny new cloud, Wendy, in your presentation, and a lot of times in security, we're trying to assess the risk associated with those shiny new things. So a lot of my role, though, is about risk, right, and advising on the better security choice. But that security choice isn't always the sensible option for our business. We have several business units, all with distinct needs, different workforce styles where people, a large percentage of our associates never even come onto our network. And so cloud services are one of the few ways that we get to serve them, touch them, and aid them in making revenue for the company. I had mentioned earlier about trying to be an enabler where possible. And how we do that is we leverage tools and processes to mitigate or eliminate the risk. And then for our residual risk, the things that we can't address, we try to quantify that in some kind of monetary value to allow the business to make smart decisions about our strategy. Today we are a hybrid environment. The amount of services that we have in the private cloud and in the public cloud varies over time based on how our workforce and our business units needs change. I can talk a little bit about the capabilities, the security capabilities that assist in helping to construct our strategy. But at the end of the day, I think it's two primary things that security folks need to be focused on with any cloud strategy design or revamp, and that's a strong vendor assessment process and mapping the data that you're going to share with cloud providers, and then also a strong security contracts team that our security-minded contracts team to help make sure that the contracts are written as much in our favor as it could be, and that we get support for breaches when we need it.
Makes sense. Maybe we'll have some time to talk about some of the key certifications as well in the next couple of rounds. So Dalia, what about for you? How are you and your team building and implementing a successful cloud strategy?
Yeah, so our decision to move to a public cloud is actually a part of a broader change that we're adopting at Capital One. We're basically changing our entire operating model. So as we thought about, how our digital innovation can disrupt the banking sector, we went through a process of reimagining our IT organizational model, our development approaches, and our delivery processes. And it became apparent to us that using the public cloud was going to become a key enabler for us. Things that we invested in heavily, from machine learning, real-time analytics, and so forth, really benefited a lot from the quote-unquote infinite resources of the public cloud. So we went through a transformation where we hired thousands of engineers with skill sets that are more aligned to DevOps models. We've started building a lot of architecting our applications differently. So we are building them as reusable microservices and using open source, which helps us also in our cloud strategy and with controlling our costs. And we adopted a cloud-first approach to all new development. So instead of thinking about how you architect your applications as an afterthought, this was what we led with any new development, is how can you build your applications with infrastructure as code, how do you make them fault tolerant, and we've started realizing a lot of the benefits. So our shift to the cloud has been really important in building speed and agility for our teams, and we're able to much faster react to customers' need and changing and evolving customer experiences. And we think that the cloud transformation that we've gone through has been just tremendous in enabling us to transform our business.
Excellent. I don't know if was anyone else thinking what's in your wallet, but anyway, sorry. Very effective.
On AWS.
And so, Duke, last but not least, would you like to share your how you're building and implementing a successful cloud strategy?
Oh, I think a lot of the stuff, the strategies and tactics that we are employing has been covered by my fellow panelists. But I think the thing that I would add is a core component of our strategy, given that we're a little bit more conservative as an organization, and you know we've grown essentially over a long period of time by assimilating other banks and bringing on many application portfolios, right? So our environment is very heterogeneous. So part of what we do is, in order to kind of make that jump, is we have a very rigorous assessment process that we apply to kind of understand the current state of our applications, right? Like make sure, see which one is, cloud ready. If they are not, what would it take to actually make it cloud ready? Obviously, some of the newer applications that we have, stuff that are greenfield, we are employing exactly what Dalia mentioned, building a robust microservices-based architecture, making use of SOA and some of the modern application best practices, right? But for the legacy stuff, I think it's an ongoing challenge, because sometimes when you have a legacy application, there might be security remediation that you need to basically work through before you get it to a state where you're comfortable enough to actually, transfer that, if you will, to the cloud. So I think we're very much, I can definitely appreciate and relate to a lot of the stuff that Robert, John, and Dalia has already covered.
Mm-hmm. And so that kind of, I think we've touched on this, just decision criteria. When do you, how are you deciding when to leverage public cloud services and when not to? Now, Robert, you mentioned a checklist. Could you share some of the key elements in that checklist, maybe that could inform others who are trying to make similar decisions, when to use, when not to?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So the primary drivers of when and where are the application readiness, and the team kind of hit on that earlier. If we aren't looking as part of our overall transformation to lift and shift, old legacy apps out to the cloud. This is absolutely part of our overall transformation. So, the things that we are pushing to the cloud are cloud ready. They are already built with the microservice technologies. They are RESTful in their interfaces. And so from a natural perspective, those lend themselves to the cloud. We're pushing to the notion of we're doing mainly containers in the cloud now. We try to not even spin up servers or compute out there. The only thing that I'll say, and John would probably like this, that we've, even if they are ready, if an application is ready, that we don't necessarily move out there just yet, is things that are either PCI or heavy SOX related items. We tend to err on the side of caution there with our security partners and leave those in our on-prem, because we still have that comfortable feeling of kind of the wall of our firewalls and the internal controls we have. As we mature in our cloud controls, by putting additional, cloud enterprise security out there, we're laxing that a little bit. But for the most part, if it contains any sort of PCI information or any sort of SOX challenges for us, we leave those on-prem.
And I do like that, Robert, by the way.
Totally agree.
I'm going to be the dissenting voice.
Yeah, tell us more.
We actually believe that anything can go to the cloud if it's well architected and we can meet our security standards. So having said that, we developed a lot of in-house controls to make sure that we are very comfortable with putting data in the cloud. So we're not gating things going to the cloud based on criticality of, how critical the data or sensitive the data is, but rather on how the applications are built for the cloud and for the security models in the cloud. So we've gone through, for instance, SOC certification of applications in the cloud. We have some of our critical banking and card applications already running in the cloud. And we've gone, through a lot of work with AWS and the regulators to be very comfortable with that.
That
right,
makes
and
sense.
that's
Go ahead, John.
I'm sorry, Wendy, go ahead. I was going to say that's interesting because the two of you have described vastly different risk appetites within your environment, right? And me, I'm a fan of keeping PCI and SOCs on-prem, but we still do have a lot of critical data and services that reside in a public cloud. For us, some of the differentiators for providers have been the SOC 1 and 2 ISO certifications. There's even a handful of cloud security certifications that organizations can get, and sometimes that helps to lower the risk appetite. My background, I've served running cybersecurity programs for the Department of Defense, and even a few years ago, there was no option for public cloud. They could not do it. And now they are moving in that direction because there are security capabilities that have been developed to allow them to lower their risk appetite in certain situations.
Yeah,
So
you're absolutely right. Being, in the banking industry, we're very highly regulated and very, very sensitive to protecting our users' data. So we've gone through a lot of certifications and put checks and balances to make sure that we're very secure.
Yeah, I think from my perspective, personally, I'm of the same mindset as Dalia. I think that from a security capabilities and just pure capabilities perspective, I think everything can go to the cloud. That being said, what I think personally, it's oftentimes it's different, or from an organizational perspective, it's not there yet, right? So I think organizationally, it's more along the lines of what John and Robert have shared, in that, I think for the mission critical, highly sensitive applications, we tend to like to keep those in-house, right? And for folks who are looking at going through their cloud journey, maybe they start out with the dev and test workloads, the lower tier applications, that type of stuff. But yeah, that would be my 2 cents.
Yeah, and Duke, that is what you described there is pretty much what we are going through at Servicemaster, right? The long-term strategy is we don't want to be in the data center business, right? But we're just not mature enough as an overall organization to have made the leap for the particular data criticality. So it is on the future roadmap. We're just not ready for that yet.
You said something that's interesting to me, Robert, which is, I would say even as recent as 3 years ago, wherever I worked, we had that same strategy to move, to not be in the data center business anymore, to move completely to public cloud. Now I would say I'm firmly in the camp of my strategy is to remain multi-cloud, to remain in my private cloud where it makes sense, and to have those capabilities, and to at the same time have capabilities for public cloud and not just one. Because I feel that I've started applying that portfolio management approach, right? There are some financial benefits to being able to swing. There are some operational benefits. And it just sort of seems, I don't know that I would build a new data center from scratch anymore, but, I certainly make use of the mix, and I relish making use of the mix. I like having all those tools in the toolbox, which sort of leads me to ask, how are the rest of you finding that right balance between, and it's a fiscal question as well, between renting or owning cloud infrastructure? Are you looking at cost models? Is it back to your checklist, Robert? What do you think?
Yeah, for us, cost is a driver of it for sure, right? If it is if it can be truly consumed as a service and we don't have to, we kind of pay for consumption, that is a big driver for us to actually push to the cloud. For us, we are made up of cyclical businesses. So, American Home Shield is one of our subsidiaries, Terminix is another. Those two are very much, summertime, very busy, and then it kind of tails off in fall and gets busy again in the winter. And so, we try not to build a church for Easter and Christmas. We try to pay by consumption and leverage the financials that we have to be able to do that. Again, I'll say we haven't done a fantastic job at this. We are getting better as we go. The play for us for cloud adoption was really more agility than a financial impact. So we have the ability to expand and contract based off the needs of our business. And so, that was the initial play when I was talking with our CEO and CFO. Subsequently, we've been able to show that, and now it is trying to find that right balance and understanding, what has to go out there, what can go out there, and what can't go out there, and then making sure that we just, we're appropriately placing it there.
Very much agreed. I think Wendy, this is kind of a difficult question in that I think there's no right balance, since it's likely going to vary from one company to another, right? Or even like a line of business within a large organization. But I think the couple of observations that I would make is you definitely have to do your homework. You have a detailed understanding of the workloads that you're running currently, right, within your line of business. Develop a robust cost estimation model so that you can kind of size how much this is going to cost you. But I think the other observation that based on kind of like the preliminary work that we've done is the public cloud is probably pretty good for us to kind of run batch processing jobs, stuff that are have applications that have burst demands, for example. That way, I think Robert touched on this, and that as you scale and need to ramp up, you can actually spill that those things out to the cloud on an as-needed basis. If there's let's say there's a massive refinance storm, for example, and you need to scale those applications, you can rapidly employ cloud capacity.
Yep. And then on the other hand, Dalia, I guess I would be interested, it sounds like for you it was a whole scale, for lack of a better term, I don't love this a lot, but digital transformation.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
So was there was it agility? Was it cost? What drove this transformation?
So it was more around agility in acquiring infrastructure, agility to get scale where our business was cyclical, and also allowing our developers to focus on the applications and what really moves the business, and worry less about things like stability in our data center. So we actually are primarily on AWS. However, we do have also a multi-cloud strategy, but it's mainly for the data piece of it, not necessarily for running workloads. And we decided, to rent and to basically take advantage of the economies of scale that we're getting on AWS from a cost perspective. Having said that, we do continue to develop the muscle about how we can optimize our costs further. So as an example, we've developed policies that would decompose our non-production environments and spin them back up on schedules. We're also looking at things like using Lambda functions as well as reserved instances for production. So I don't think we've cracked the secret sauce yet for cost optimization on AWS, but we're working on it at the moment.
Great. One last thing I wanted to touch on that we were talking about earlier is the value of certifications, particularly for public cloud vendors. So I've sort of been, at a minimum asking to see the SOC 2 certification, sometimes SOC 1. But I have to admit I struggle with some of this. What about SOC 3? Any thoughts for us, John, on what are the basic certs that we should be looking for, and also if we're hybrid, if we're on-prem and partially using a public cloud, should we try to achieve that same level of certification internally so that we're at the same, we're using the same standards across internal and public?
Those are great questions. So first, the certifications and attestations for public cloud providers. I think when they have them, that for us in our process, that answers a slew of security questions. However, depending on the workload that we're going to give them or the data that we store there, sometimes that certification isn't enough. We will also schedule meetings with them to review some basics and ask questions to get a good feel for how robust their security program really is. With that being said, if they lack those certifications, that isn't a deal breaker for us. It just extends the period of time and the level of effort that we invest, ensuring that they have what's required to make us comfortable with any risk involved with moving our services there. I've even gone to the point of actually doing screen shares with a provider, so that they can show me documentation. They weren't comfortable handing it over, but that doesn't mean that I can't review it with them to make sure that they provide enough evidence to give a good feeling that they're doing the right things. Internally, I don't know that achieving those certifications would be necessarily worthwhile. However, the frameworks for a lot of these are published, right? And most security frameworks have very similar controls. They're all sort of based on the same concepts. I think knowing your security maturity internally is key, period. You have to know where you stand and where your weaknesses are so that you can develop a roadmap to get better in the areas that matter. But I would think that your security teams could speak the same language, so to speak, with the cloud providers, whether they're SOC 1 and 2 or they have an ISO certification, et cetera.
Great. Well, I understand that there have been a number of folks asking questions, and I thought now might be a good time to to turn to some audience questions. So I don't know if, yeah, go ahead.
Thank you, Wendy. First question from the audience. How do you get application developers to rethink their philosophy in trusting the resiliency at the infrastructure layer and cloud services versus coding the resiliency within applications?
Maybe I can lead off and say that I've seen two methods. I'll use Netflix as an example. Netflix famously, when they moved to public cloud, dismissed, let go a few hundred of their internal IT folks and hired new folks because they had a need for speed. And essentially there was this notion that, people think differently, and they needed to find folks who, had this more, this idea of not having to build resiliency into the infrastructure layers. Now, on the other hand, when I was at Robert Half and we did very much what Capital One has done, we moved from completely on-prem to completely public cloud. And my goal at that time was that, no developer, no IT person would be left behind. And so I spent, I built 18 months into my plans to train folks and to give them experience, building in the cloud and give them experience with, how the capabilities of cloud work. And, either way, there's an expense and there's churn. But I can honestly say, sort of ethically, it felt better to take the 18 months. I don't always, you don't always have that much time. But ultimately today, you at least need to have strong leads in each of your teams who understand how to compose from the beginning for the cloud. I don't know if any of the other panelists have some thoughts.
Yes,
yeah, I think the thing that I would add. Oh, go ahead, Charlie. I'll let you finish. I think the thing that I would add to what Wendy just shared is you need to be comfortable and attain a certain level of automation within your existing portfolio, like be it infrastructure or applications. Because I think as Wendy touched on earlier, it's different. It's a different mindset, right? You're caring less about achieving the perfection, if you will, through code or making sure everything is bug free, but you just kind of assume that things are going to break, and it's okay that it breaks because you have a set of tools and automated processes behind the scene to reestablish the application and get it back up and running. I think that's a key part of how we are thinking about to make this work from our side. Dalia, what are your thoughts?
Yeah. So when we started on this journey of transformation, we were also heavily outsourced. We've gone through a massive effort of insourcing and hiring our own developers internally. So that was a great opportunity to bring in experts that have had a lot of experience in the cloud. And we also, in addition to that, went through massive training on cloud skills. We have a significant number of our engineers are AWS certified, and that really helped us in the migration strategy. We did not do a lift and shift of applications. In a lot of cases, we actually looked at the architecture and adjusted to the cloud. And it was with the idea in mind as not to rely on the infrastructure in the cloud to be resilient. We expected that it's going to fail and that the applications are able to address those infrastructure failures, whether it's through auto-scaling or through other methods, so that you're actually building your applications with that in mind.
Makes sense.
All right, perfect. Thank you, panelists. Moving on to the second question, how do you manage risk of lock-in via diversifying into multiple vendor clouds platforms? How do you maintain consistency, portability of applications and processes across the vendors? Also, just a reminder to the panelists of the content neutrality policy to keep things vendor neutral, so referring to an overall category as opposed to a specific product or a specific.
Got it. So I think I would let me lead off unless another panelist has a thought. It's really, for me, there's just one of three things we can do. You can either like Dalia had an opportunity to do, you can purpose-build applications and code sets that can run anywhere. And if you have done that, then then it's not such a stretch to have multiple cloud vendors, like the Snapchat example I gave. They make use of both AWS and Google, right? So there's it's being able to run your code in multiple places because you were thoughtful about that from the beginning. So that's certainly one choice. If you already have legacy and you can't do that, then there's only another couple of choices. One is using a core cloud OS that can run anywhere and serve all the workloads and apps, or having a larger and skilled team who essentially can script, can modify, can move, can make that code more portable. But I do believe even in each of the categories where it's pure public cloud or where it's on-prem infrastructure, having a multi-vendor strategy from the very beginning and being able to negotiate among vendors is absolutely core to your core skills as an IT leader. You've got to have that, and you've got to master that vendor management layer. And so if your code locks you into one vendor, that's no good. If your team skills lock you into just one vendor, that's no good. So you've got to adjust your code, or you've got to adjust the skills, or work on the OS, one of those areas, to give yourself flexibility. But it's not okay to blame a single vendor strategy on a lack in any of those other areas. I don't think we keep our jobs for long if we're dependent on a vendor because of our technical skills, or dependent on a vendor because of our legacy code set.
Yeah, and to add on to that, I think for us, architecture are probably our primary way to ensure that we try to avoid lock-in as much as possible. There are instances where we are utilizing technology stacks that have us in a position where we might be locked in, but we are aggressively attacking those. And that coalition I mentioned earlier, that team is, one of their big charters is to ensure that anything that needs to be portable can be portable, and anything that is not portable has a forward-looking path in case we need to move it to a different vendor.
Right, perfect. Thank you. Next question. Where do you see cloud strategy security evolving over the next 5 years?
That's a great question. I'll take that. So, so I guess cloud security strategy is relatively new. The CASBs were probably first talked about 4 or 5 years ago. I think that those products still have not been widely implemented. I mean, even for us, we are just now beginning to consider those because the services that we have in the cloud have not reached critical mass within the company. So, from a business perspective, it just didn't make sense to invest. I think that as we move more and more services and users to the cloud, that we will need that single pane of glass for visibility and control and identity access management, et cetera. So I would expect that these solutions become better. One other thing that I expect to become better is the ability to move our services to less risky public cloud providers. So if you have a private cloud and a public cloud, or even multiple public clouds, the ability to automatically assess risk with each environment and then choose which environment you run your services in and automatically move them, I think is going to be key to reduce the overall risk.
Yeah, and while we are on AWS, we are using our own VPCs, virtual private clouds within AWS, and we do have security implemented in that. We have our own scanning tools, security scanning tools that we use there, and where in areas where we did not find the right tools to be able to feel good about having our critical applications there from a security standpoint, we've actually developed in-house tools to ensure that all our security policies and access management is very well scrutinized and under control.
Yeah, I think, Dalia, you're really hitting the nail on the head there, at least from my perspective. I think what I found is I found some tools and some capabilities. Yes, we use the VPC, to create an environment that we can control as well. But I think right now the state of the art is that you're still going to have your internal team creating, scripting, coding some of the capabilities that you need internally. I haven't, like John said, I haven't found any vendor who is mature and has all the features and functions that we need across clouds. But we do build a bit of our own, and I think you've just got to plan to be in that mode. Generally, when you're in public cloud, and definitely when you're in multi-cloud.
Mm-hmm. I think the other challenge too, on top of everything that's been said, it's a lot of the tools and vendors that you're currently using to monitor and just kind of keep an eye on your current environment don't play well as you move workloads to the cloud, right? Like your Tivoli, your HP OVO stuff. Those things, when you move a particular application to the cloud, it probably doesn't make sense for you to redeploy those agents, right? To monitor that application. So you definitely have to use things and figure out what are some of the new tools and capabilities that you need to bring on board in order to continue to monitor and have assurance that things are still running well and safe as it moves to the cloud.
Yeah, I think vendors need to get cost models better in line as well. At the same time, I will say that we have lately found some real innovative vendors, and so there are some folks who are innovating in this space, and I think that's a great thing about public cloud generally, is it's really pushing the pace of innovation. And when we have a need, there are usually some hungry upstarts in addition to the traditional vendors who are working to find solutions to these common problems. So I am encouraged. I'm not naming vendors, but I have found some newer tools that are pretty slick.
Mm-hmm.
All right, thank you, Wendy. And moving on to the final question. This is coming from an attendee who is in financial services. When developing a cloud strategy for my bank, is there anything I need to be aware of to avoid any negative issues with the FDIC examiners?
You need to be able, being in a bank, you're probably familiar with all the reviews that you have to go through with regulators. And one of the things that we had to work through with AWS is how do you provide the ability to audit and be able to give the regulators the evidence that they need, that you're very responsible with the data and be able to have that. And that was something that we worked very closely with Amazon on to make sure that those capabilities get built in and the logging and auditing capability became available. So that was one of the biggest things that we had to tackle before we were able to move in that direction.
So part of what I heard in your reply was that the vendors that you work with need to be willing to work with you and open enough to take that journey with you. That's good advice for all of us, even if we're not in the financial sector. But of particular importance in highly regulated sectors is as public cloud vendors in particular move away from that consumer start and into the enterprise start, they have to be willing to work with us as experts in our fields and be willing to add functionality or be more open. And I think, seeing a vendor demonstrate that, whoever that is really, really key. It's going to be a partnership.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I think, most of the time, besides architecture and security, I think the other long leg in the cloud engagement is likely going to be supply chain and legal, right? Like that negotiation, if you will, between your organization and the cloud provider might be, months, perhaps even years long, like to get all the terms and conditions, right, that both parties are comfortable to.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to thank everyone for joining us today for this fantastic virtual event. As mentioned, you will receive a link to a brief survey about your experience today, and we would appreciate you sharing your candid feedback. You'll also receive a follow-up email with the recording within 48 hours. Thanks again, and enjoy the rest of your day.